first time I attended a sudden death. It was a motorcycle gang member, drove straight into a palm tree. That was, as a 20-year-old, picking up someone's head, and it felt like, I described it as a bag full of broken pottery. I've seen it firsthand. My relatives, were in gangs, and also my 10 years in the police. Obviously, I'm interacting with the gangs all the time.
So you were in the police force for several years.
Yeah, I did my 10 years. I wanted to do 10 years. So I had a really fruitful and rewarding career. Most of that was spent in the CIB as a detective. And yeah, it was great. It was traumatic. It was stressful. Didn't realize it at the time what was going on. But, the way we dealt with trauma back in those days was just go out and drink lots and misbehave and, and comfort by numbers, security in numbers.
Yes. Can you give us some examples, Sean, of the traumatic things that you experienced? I mean, are we talking like shootings and stabbings and stuff? And
yeah, so in terms of my own personal safety, nothing like that, although I was in fights and there was lots of attacks with with weapons and things like that. But when I say traumatic, I'm talking about the experiences that I had to attend, anything from murders and rapes and child molestation and all that sort of carry on, and right through to car accidents and attending deaths and things like that. So I wrote in my book about the very first time I attended a sudden death. It was a motorcycle gang member, drove straight into a palm tree. And back in those days, they wore, those sort of German style army helmets. They were completely useless at protecting your head, and they didn't even tie them down. So, as he collided and, impacted against a tree, nothing protected his head. So I was a 20-year-old policeman then, and I'd only been in the police about several weeks, and I attended, because I was I rode motorcycles back then as well. So that was my first sudden death that I attended all by myself, and I had to deal with it all by myself. And that was, as a 20-year-old, picking up someone's head, and it felt like, I described it as a bag full of broken pottery. When you try to handle with as much compassion as you could the body, and it was just like a sack of broken pottery. And that was my first sort of exposure to death. And over the years, you attended lots and lots of sudden death and deaths through car crashes and all sorts of other hangings and murders and bodies that have been in lakes for bloody weeks and been discovered and stuff like that. So that's the trauma I'm talking about. And then there's the other side of trauma is when you're just dealing with just really bad people, doing really bad things to other people, like children, for example, children's sex offending and rapes and real violent offending as well. So yeah, that's the sort of trauma that I'm talking about, that you deal with, or you think you're dealing with, and you probably are dealing with it on the outside, because normally the good thing about being in the police is when you're dealing with scenarios or serious crimes or anything, those sorts of situations, you're usually with a group, you're with numbers, and there's comfort in numbers. So you all sort of deal with the situation and then you go and sort of debrief, and then you go out. Back in my day, you get on the piss, and you know, and just to deal with it in numbers like that. And you know, my belief is that anxiety conditions are a learned behavior, but I also do believe that there's probably some predisposition as well. You know, some people may be a bit more prone to, you know, being exposed to or succumbing to anxiety or whatever, for whatever reason.
Do you think,
and
Sean?
there's an analogy, like, you know, your upbringing and your personality and your disposition, like, loads the gun, right? Puts the bullet in the gun and cocks it. But it's your nurture, it's your environment, it's your conditioning and your learned behavior that pulls the trigger. So just because you might have a disposition to being a bit more, you know, a bit more anxious or a bit more shy or whatever, because of your upbringing or whatever, it doesn't mean you have to put up with that shit.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have to let it rule your life and let it limit you and restrict you to do whatever you want in life.
Before we move on, Sean, I think our friends at home would find it fascinating if we could talk a bit about Maori culture in New Zealand. Sorry to sort of step back, but you mentioned the chap on the motorbike, and I've seen just through the media, is it the Mongrel mob is a big gang down your way?
It's one of them. We've got several ethnic, if you like, gangs. We've got the Mongrel mob, are fairly big. We've got the Black Power, they're fairly big. And there's another couple of other shoots as well that I'm not even going to dignify by mentioning. But those are the two main ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of you know, our youth are going for identity and self-worth and sort of belonging and shit like that.
Yes, my first sort of introduction to that part of life in New Zealand was the film Once Were Warriors, which was a huge hit over here. Anybody that grew up, you know, my generation, or certainly watched videos, I think it was in the 80s. So you got introduced to this indigenous people in New Zealand, and they all seemed bloody big, very tattooed, and a bit psycho. Of course, having been there, I now understand the socio-economic implications of how New Zealand has developed since it was colonized. Sorry if that's not the right word, but since
that's all good.
You know, since the Northerners went down there. But that film was like really hard hitting. Does that still play out in parts? Is that kind of what the Mongrel mob type of culture comes from?
Yeah, and I can vouch for that because, you know, I'm Ngāti Kahanunu, and I was brought up in Hawke's Bay in Marae Nui, which is the sort of lower socio-economic area of Napier, the Hawke's Bay. So I've seen it firsthand. My relatives, you know, were in gangs, and also my 10 years in the police. Obviously, I'm interacting with the gangs all the time. So it's definitely a thing. It's pretty accurate. But I just need to stress that that's the minority. You know, it's most people growing up will never be exposed to that environment. You know, it's not an environment that you see everywhere you go. You'd have to go to a particular part of town we call them public bars. They're called public bars here. Where that sort of profile, member of society or sector of society go. So it's definitely a minority, but they can be rat bags and they can cause a bit of problems. They normally only cause problems within themselves. You know, they keep to themselves. But now and then it spills over to the general public. But otherwise, they keep to themselves.
What is it that makes some Indigenous Maori have the tattoos? And I'm obviously thinking the facial tattoos in particular, and some people choose not to. I think it's an obvious answer, but I'm not going to get the chance to ask somebody this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if this is probably outside my swim lane, to be fair, but from my own experience, that's a sense of identity, and it's a sense of belonging. It gives them a sense of, like I said, identity and part of a whānau, part of a gang.
Yeah.
So it gives them that self-worth. Why some do and some don't. I don't really know, but it definitely is part of the culture.
Like respect for ancestors as well, I would imagine.
Well, there is that type of tattoo or moko, but the ones with the swastikas and sikal and all that, the other part of the side of the tattooing, that's more about belonging to a gang or a family. That's their new family, and they're just identifying themselves and parading and advertising the family, the whānau that they now belong to. And it seems like a good idea at the time, but it usually bites them in the bum when they grow up, because a lot of them grow up and come to their senses. And
yeah, of course. And crystal meth was something I fell foul of in Hong Kong, as anyone who's read my memoir will know. I believe that's called P in New Zealand, is it?
Yep.
Methamphetamine. And
big problem.
I'm guessing these gangs are dealing this sort of stuff in large quantities to fund their activities.
Yeah, so that's that's the intelligence. That's what we're being led to believe, and I think there's probably a bit of truth to that in my experience as a policeman. That sort of drug dealing and manufacture and sale. There's always a gang element there, definitely.
Yes, and it's interesting because New Zealand, I mean, it is that country that's always quoted as being so far away from the rest of the world, which is wonderful for you guys, and it's great for us backpackers that have been down there, because it's just an amazing place. And we could have a whole podcast just talking about the diversity in New Zealand, the exciting things to do, all the adventure sports. I did my first part of my skydiving course down at Taupo. The trout fishing is amazing. It's got to be the best in the world. The rainbow trout are huge. The volcanic springs, the sulfuric fumes coming up from the drain covers from the volcanic activity. The landscape is, I mean, Lord of the Rings obviously was filmed there, and anyone who's seen that movie would get something from just visiting New Zealand alone.
For sure.
But just to finish off, because I don't want to detract too much from your story, Sean, I'm just really fascinated about such things. Grass, as in weed, is obviously grown in the local area. I'm guessing the pea or the meth is either made in New Zealand or shipped from Asia or Australia.
That's a good question. I think that we probably manufacture most of it, in my opinion.